好，华美人文学会的观众朋友们，大家好，可以听到我的声音吗？如果您可以听到我的声音，请您在我们的对话框打一个1，让我来知道一下，可以吗？大家可以听到我的声音吗？
可以的。
好的，非常感谢大家再一次来到我们华美人文学会的周末讲座系列，我是主持人刘畅。那么熟悉我们华美人文学会讲座的朋友啊，大家应该参加过我们以往的话题。那么我们以前呢讲过赛珍珠，他呢在美国用英语进行过对于中国这个历史画卷的一个描述的这样的一个创作。那么同时呢，我们熟悉的一些作家，比如说林语堂、张爱玲这样的华裔作家，他们也用英文进行过这个描述中国这个文化、描述中国生活的写作。那么同时呢，我们还请过这个 Kiki 老师啊，给我们讲过很多这个在美国的华裔作家，他们如何通过英语的这样的一个创作来体现他们的这个本土文化的。但是大家可能有所不知呢，那么在美国的历史上，第一位用英文进行写作的作家，他就是我们今天的这个主讲的这样的一个主角，叫李富恩。所以呢，今天我们就是非常有幸请到了这个一位专业的教授来给我们进行讲解。那么具体内容呢，稍后何勇博士将给我们进行介绍。那么在我们讲座开始之前呢，我还是按照惯例给大家来介绍一下我们今天的讲座规则。首先呢，在您进来的时候，您的声音还有视频默认都是关闭的。如果在我们的讲座过程当中呢，您的声音还有视频不小心被开启，请您自行关闭。那在我们讲座结束之后呢，将留给大家一部分时间，大家呢可以向我们今天的主讲嘉宾来进行提问还有互动。当然也欢迎您在我们的过程当中把您想互动的话题以及提问的问题打在我们的对话框，那么稍后我会为大家来进行提问以及互动。那么今天呢，还有一点是想跟大家来提醒一下，就是我们今天的讲座呢，全程都是将用英语来进行，所以呢，您想互动或者想提问的问题呢，可以用中文还有英文双语来进行哈。那我们稍后呢都会这个来向我们的主讲嘉宾来这个一一进行的解答和互动。好，那下面我们就请出我们华美人文学会的联席主席何勇博士。
可以看到我吗？
好的。
Okay. Now let's switch to the English mode. Welcome to today's lecture. We're quite honored today to have Professor Mike Duval with us, who will tell us the story of Yanfu Li or Li Enfu. Yeah, Li Enfu was truly a trailblazing individual, holding the esteemed title of being the first Chinese American to publish a book in the United States. Professor Duval's expertise will provide valuable insights into Li Enfu's contributions as a writer, his groundbreaking book, and his unwavering determination to rectify misunderstandings surrounding China and its people through his writings. So Dr. Mike Duval is Associate Professor and Associate Chair of English at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. He teaches American literature and culture with a focus on the late 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, which was a pivotal period during which Li Enfu was writing and publishing. So Professor Duval recently wrote an important academic article on Li Enfu, which will soon be published in the upcoming issue of Global 19th Century Studies. So I believe Professor Duval will share with us some of his findings in his article. So now let's welcome Professor Duval.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, in some cases. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Let me take over the screen. Okay. All right, so I hope I have successfully taken over the screen, and you should see Yan Fu Li in America, the cover slide. Can I just get a verification that that's
Yes,
you
yes.
seeing that? Okay, all right, thanks. Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to the Renwen Society and China Institute and you, Young Ho, for inviting me to give this lecture. And I also want to thank Lu Chung for the technical assistance tonight. And one more thank you. I want to express my gratitude to Kathy Huang, who I think is in the audience tonight and who recommended me to Young Ho. And thank you all in the audience for being here tonight and joining me to hear the story of Lian Fu, or Yan Fu Li, as he referred to himself during his time in America. But in truth, I can only say that I can't give you the story. I can only give you part of what I know from what I've studied and the archival work I've done. A full account of Li's life is certainly yet to be written. And also just an apology in advance for my inevitable mispronunciations of Chinese names and places. So I'll begin by saying a little bit about the institution in which I work and have worked for the last 17 years. The College of Charleston is located in Charleston, South Carolina, on the southeastern coast of the United States. We're a public liberal arts and sciences centered university located in downtown Charleston, and we recently celebrated our 250th birthday. The college is the oldest municipal college in the country and among the oldest colleges and universities in the country as well. And we have around 10,000 students, undergraduate and graduate alike. So I want to pause before beginning my lecture just to acknowledge the people who made this place their home and whose labor built the college before the Civil War put an end to chattel slavery. The city of Charleston sits on the unceded lands of indigenous peoples of the coastal South Carolina, including the Catawba, Chickasaw, Oyate, Edisto, Santee, Yamasee, Waccamaw, and Natchezcuzo. And what you're seeing on screen is a copy of an 18th century Catawba map, originally in deerskin, presented to an early English governor of Charleston. Charleston was also the location where somewhere around 40% of the enslaved African people in what became the United States were bought and sold. Here we see a late 18th century Charleston auction notice for sale and continued enslavement of human beings. Buildings on our institution were indeed built by enslaved people, whose descendants were, until 1967, actively banned from attending our school. This is a brick from one of our buildings at the college, and it bears the impression of the fingers of its maker, very probably an enslaved person, and it serves as an emblem and reminder of our debt at the college and elsewhere to the past and to the enslaved. So at the college, we strive to acknowledge these legacies and to pay them respect and study them as we actively work against systems of oppression that perpetuate such legacies even to this day. So I'll begin the lecture. An eventful and somewhat romantic life, Yan Fu Li in America. The intro line there, eventful and somewhat romantic, those are Yan Fu Li's words. He gave an interview in 1894 in St. Louis, and the correspondent asked him, can you tell me about your life? And he said in a very characteristic way for Yan Fu Li, that it was eventful and somewhat romantic. This is understated, this is ironic. By 1894, he had certainly had many triumphs in his life, but he had numerous challenges. And so he used this typical ironic understatement a lot, as we'll see. So my plan was to break my talk this evening into 4 sections. but I'm going to have to alter that a little bit. I will begin by talking a little bit about how I became interested in Lee, and after which I will describe his book, When I Was a Boy in China, the first book published by a Chinese American. And I believe the first book published by an Asian American of any description in the United States. I then will speak about Lee's early life with particular focus on his time as an adolescent and young man in the Chinese educational mission, which brought him and over 100 other boys to the United States in the early 1870s. I'll then turn to the part of Lee's life that I know best and where my research has focused over the past several years. Lee's development as a writer during his final 3 years as a student at what was then called Yale College and is now Yale University. During this time, Lee engaged in an impressive self-cultivation as a writer on a mission to better represent the Chinese in America during a period of terrible fear of the Chinese in the United States, and the development of national laws and policy to end Chinese immigration with very few exceptions, and essentially enshrining xenophobia at the heart of the nation. I had hoped to close with an account of what I've been able to discover about Lee's life after he completed his time at Yale. It's a period in which there's very little known. Lee was continuously adapting after that point. He was trying many different occupations, which included continuous work as a writer and editor, but he was no longer a writer who commanded a national attention for his writing. I just don't feel like I'll be able to get to that, but I do have a few things to say regarding that. So let me just say one more thing in a preliminary way. Like all scholars, my work builds on the path-breaking work of others. There are two terrific biographical sources on the life of Yan-Fu Lee that serve as a jumping-off point for my own work. Richard Vale Lee's, that's Lee's grandson, Richard Vale Lee, Lee's grandson, gathered and recounted key events of Yan-Fu Lee's life in the introduction and afterword of his 2003 edition of When I Was a Boy in China, which I believe you may have a link to on the webpage for this lecture. Richard Lee's introduction is well worth your time. His own story of coming to know about his grandfather is a fascinating tale in and of itself, and it connects his grandfather's life to and his own life in a way to the legal discrimination against intermarriage between whites and Asians that continued well into the 20th century. Another essential biographical treatment of Lee can be found in a book chapter by Amy Ling. Ling was a pioneering Asian American studies scholar whose chapter of this book, entitled Yan-Fu Lee on the Asian American Frontier, was published posthumously in 2002. Amy Ling speaks of, and this is a quote, reading between the facts of Lee's life and between the lines of his writings. And my own work is continuing that form of reading and analysis by adding many more facts and many more of Lee's writings to the record and trying to grapple with them and understand them. So tonight and in my own work, I'm standing on the shoulders of Richard Lee and Amy Ling in my extension of their work, some of which I share with you this evening, and part of which will be published in that upcoming issue of the academic journal Global 19th Century Studies, which I think is supposed to be out in the fall. Finally, one last thing. If you would like to pursue some of this reading on your own, I've put together a document with references and links when available, and they can be found in this QR code, and I will drop into chat right now, if I can, a direct URL if you want to follow that out. All right, so I think all the preliminaries are gone. So let me just move into the first section of my talk. I am, as Young Ho said, a specialist in American literature, and specifically late 19th 19th century or late 1800s and early 20th century. And over the years, I've taught more than a dozen different courses in American literature. The bulk of those tend to be what you might call mainstream. They're courses that, surveys of American lit, or maybe courses on American novels and that kind of thing. But about 12 years ago, I began to really focus my energies as a teacher on broadening the scope of the literature I teach, broadening my own understanding of it to include the writing of underrepresented groups in the United States as well. And so I designed and taught a course that centers the writing of marginalized people at the end of the 19th and turn of the 20th century. And that is a period that spans what is often called the Gilded Age and Progressive Era in the US. And it is also the beginning of the regime of Chinese exclusion. I wanted to provide my students and myself with an opportunity to study by writing by individuals in these groups comparatively. So I focused the class on the writing of African Americans, Indigenous Americans, Eastern European immigrants, and Asian Americans, represented in the columns you see from left to right. Preparing for the class made it clear to me how little I knew about these writers and their individual and group histories. And my knowledge was especially thin when it came to Asian American history and writing in the period. And it became very clear to me that Asian American literature in this period is relatively scarce. I knew that I would be including in my course the writing of Sui Sun Far. I had taught a couple pieces by hers in sophomore literature surveys for years. There's a wonderful memoir called Leaves in the Mental Portfolio of an Eurasian, and a fiction piece called In the Land of the Free. And I knew I would also include the writing of her sister, who took a Japanese pen name, Anata Watana, which is an interesting situation. But fortunately, Google Books search turned up for me Lee's book. I didn't know about it. And in due course, I discovered its importance to American literary history as that important first book. And I included it in the reading list. And as we read these literary texts, we also read about and discussed pertinent historical and legal events related to each group. And in this way, students were learning the centrality of the story of Chinese immigration to the history of immigration in the US and to the development even of our understandings of American identity. And by this means, we also took stock of how oppressions faced by different marginalized and racialized groups unfolded alongside each other. There we go. For instance, the Chinese Exclusion Law of 1882 and its predecessors and successors were articulated and developed at roughly the same time as the dissemination and forced assimilation of Indigenous Americans, the post-Reconstruction terrorism inflicted on Black people in the South and throughout the nation, and the rise of Jim Crow, and the oppression of Southern, Eastern, and Central Europeans who were pulled to the US by our rapid industrialization and were also codified as inferior beings in cultural and legal discourse. In the course, we discovered what each literary text might teach us in relation to those legacies of oppression and how they might speak to us today, and they do in so many urgent ways. I found Lee's book fascinating, and so did my students. So just to give you a thumbnail sketch of the book itself, the book's title seems to promise an autobiography, but it's so much more than that. It's a slim volume. Maybe some of you have read it, just over 100 pages, and it features 12 chapters. The book covers such topics as raising of children, family structure, household arrangements, the differences between Chinese boys and girls, childhood games, foodways, public markets, school life, storytelling, holidays, and the like. And the book gives us glimpses into children's lives in China from the perspective of a Chinese man. And it is this perspective that makes the book stand out in its time. American readers who wanted to know about the lives of Chinese people had to rely on Western accounts that often trafficked in stereotypes and misconceptions, not to mention at times outright ethnic and racial bigotry. Lee set out to correct these misunderstandings. As we'll see, he took this as his mission. And in this book, he shared his thoughts not simply as a Chinese man, but also as a modern cross-cultural figure. And this was an image he deliberately cultivated. He embodies it in a photo at the front of the book. Here we see Lee wearing Western attire. And to emphasize his adoption of Western ways, he undersigns or endorses his image in English cursive. And he notes in the first few pages of the book that he has chosen to arrange, as he puts it, his given name, Li Yanfu, in accordance with American custom as Yanfu Li. And that is the name he used consistently throughout his life in the US in various ways as a writer, but also for legal documents and such. I'm going to take a quick sip of water, if that's okay. Okay. Excuse me. The book offers an interesting experience for the modern reader and for the student of literature precisely because it is so much more than an autobiography. So a reader coming to Lee's book expecting a smooth unfolding of a narrative focused on Lee's personal boyhood will not necessarily find that, but will find so much more. It's a compendium of facts and cross-cultural analysis, and it ranges widely in content and focus. The book seems to shift somewhat abruptly from one subject to another, from Chinese naming conventions to Chinese cookery, or from children's toys and schooling to religious traditions in China. And this broad canvas and shifting subject mode of writing continues throughout the book. And in the end, it does not resolve in any kind of tidy conclusion. Whereas the book begins decidedly at the beginning with a chapter called Infancy, it closes somewhat abruptly. There's no concluding chapter per se, or even a concluding paragraph for that matter. The book's last chapter leaves the scene of China altogether, dedicating itself to an account of Lee's arrival in America in 1872 with a group of Chinese students in the Chinese educational mission. I want to take time to focus on one event that Lee recounts in this chapter that seems to me emblematic of his sensibility. On the boys' train voyage from San Francisco to Springfield, Massachusetts, a violent gang of white bandits robbed the train they were on, in the process causing it to wreck and killing the engineer. Historian Edward Rhodes, who has written about the Chinese educational mission, is probably the best book on it, has identified the culprits as none other than the notorious James Gang. Lee sums up this harrowing event with his characteristic deadpan, ironic detachment, such as we see in the subtitle of my lecture, which is accentuated by passive voice in English. So by means of this violent, deadly interruption in their transit across America, the American continent, and you can imagine how frightening it must have been for these kids. One phase of American civilization, Lee says, was thus indelibly fixed upon our minds. So now in the very next paragraph, Lee rapidly shifts the scene again to recounting his arrival in Springfield, Massachusetts. But the taste of that violent criminal episode does not fade, and even a moderately sensitive reader can feel in it a scorching irony, to adopt a phrase Frederick Douglass uses, a scorching irony at the heart of the land of the free. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead too far. Bear with me while I reposition everything. Okay. I taught when I was a boy in China across 3 offerings of the class I designed, and each time I became more intrigued with its discontinuous style of presentation, and I became ever more curious about its author. I had provided my students with a PDF file of the original 1887 publication. That's the book I used. That's the edition. So I had yet to discover Richard Lee's 2003 edition and Amy Ling's book chapter. And those sources set me off on my path as a researcher. But what really galvanized my interest in the book and in the man was my stumbling across the fact that Lee's book first appeared not as a book, but in monthly installments in a children's magazine called Wide Awake, in which the contents of Lee's book appeared a full 2 years prior to its publication as a book. And here's just a close-ups on the cover. In fact, this is the cover of the issue in which Lee's first chapter appears. This new knowledge opened up all kinds of questions for me. How does it change our understanding of Lee's book to think of it not as a book, but as a series of articles and as written for children, which I didn't quite guess when I first read it? Who were these children and what expectations did they bring to reading Lee's articles? How might Lee's articles interact with other stories and material in this magazine and other magazines? Were there other writings in these magazines about the Chinese or Chinese people? How did Lee's writing for children interact with the broad anti-Chinese sentiment in the US at the time? And behind this, who really was Yanfu Lee? The College of Charleston generously granted me a sabbatical for a semester to study these and other questions, and I'm sharing with you tonight much of what I have discovered. Okay, so on to the next section, Li Yanfu and the Chinese educational mission. Li was born on March 31st, 1861 in Guangdong province in Zhongshan. Again, apologies for my pronunciation, which is an island on the western side of the Pearl River Delta. In his Yale records, he is said to hail from Fragrant Hills, which is an English translation of that place. His grandfather was a scholar official in the Qing government, according to Li, a literary sub-chancellor. And there's an indication that his father and his uncle also had ambitions in this area as well. Lee's unmarried uncle adopted him on his deathbed so that he could pass on his property to him. And his father passed away when he was 9. 3 years later, Lee was recruited by one of his cousins for the Chinese educational mission, which began operations in 1872 as an outgrowth of what has been called China's self-strengthening movement. To avoid future military losses to European powers bent on acquiring and extracting resources from China, and to be prepared for internal unrest such as that represented by the Taiping Rebellion, the Qing court engaged in efforts to develop military and civil infrastructure. Seeking to, sorry, I lost my place. Seeking to adopt technology from the West and making efforts to wean itself off of dependence on European experts and technocrats. The Chinese educational mission was designed by Young Wing, who himself had lived in the US for many years and was a graduate of Yale, actually. And I believe had US citizenship, which was then retroactively revoked, I understand, later in the century. And Young Wing was able to gain the Manchu court's endorsement of the plan as part of the self-strengthening movement. In a nutshell, the CEM brought Chinese boys to the US to live with American families in the Northeast, attend American schools, and go on to earn college degrees, particularly in what we now call STEM fields, but also in the liberal arts, which was the path that Lee pursued. With this intimate knowledge of Western science, engineering, technology, and culture, the young men were supposed to return to take leading roles in China's self-strengthening. And here are a couple more images. These are just several boys who were part of the mission. I don't believe there are any photos of Yanfu Li as a CEM participant, at least none that I know of or that have been discovered as of yet. So these boys would attend American schools, and they did, but at the same time, they had to continue their instruction in Chinese culture and religion, which was conducted by Chinese adult supervisors. They were closely monitored to make sure that they did not stray too far into Western and American ways, but as you might guess, this arrangement of being in both places at once ultimately puts these kids in a kind of in-between situation. Lee's destination was Springfield, Massachusetts, where he and another child were taken in by the Vail family. He was so close to the Vails that he later named his third child, Clarence Vail Lee, born in 1898, in their honor. And Lee's fourth child, Lewis Emerson Lee, in turn passed on the Vail middle name to his own son, Lee's grandson, Richard Vail Lee, whom I mentioned earlier. Yanfu Lee went to school in Springfield for some time before relocating to New Haven, Connecticut, to attend the Hopkins Grammar School. This was a fairly exclusive preparatory school for higher education, and still is, apparently. This is the, I guess, above the portico, the entrance to the school. Students who did well at Hopkins, which focused on an education in Greek and Latin, could transition very effectively to Yale, and Lee did just that, entering the academic program in 1880 and not the engineering program in the fall of 1880. On the whole, Lee did top-notch work as a CEM student and therefore as a representative of China. And this is something to keep in mind. I think these were just boys, exceptional boys, but still just boys. Yet at the same time, they were expected to represent China, and in particular, the Qing court. And they no doubt felt that responsibility keenly, and perhaps at times as a great burden. Lee excelled in his American education, as did many of the boys. Here's a glowing estimation of Lee offered by T.P. Vail of the family that boarded and cared for Lee in Springfield. And I'll read this off of the screen. "We are old chums," he said. "I'm proud of what the boy has done. Let him blush. I tell you, for a Chinese boy to come to America when 12 years old, learn the language, pass through the Springfield public schools with honor, and then go through the preparatory course at Dr. Hopkins Grammar School at New Haven and be valedictorian of the class. Boy, it's like breathless. I'm running out of breath reading this. #1 in English composition, Chinese boy, mind you, and #1 in English composition, #3 in Greek, and editor of the class paper a year and a half. He deserves that I should call him a trump." So at this point, I want to return to the earlier image as I shared of the Chinese kids in the educational mission for the purpose of illustrating the degree to which Americanization seems to have been difficult for the CEM boys to resist. Here are 3 images that really point out the ease and naturalness with which these Chinese boys had adopted a kind of Western and American comportment. Wu Chengyan, a 4-button top coat, watch chain, leaning nonchalantly on a rock. The Orientals, the baseball club, variously posed arms akimbo or folded or laying about on a grass lawn. Cao Kai Shang, sporting a jaunty neckerchief cradling that American symbol of manliness in his lap. The difficulty of taking in a Western education while also not imbibing Western culture was a central challenge to the Chinese educational mission. Li says, and this is a quote, "The Chinese government simply wished us to maintain or obtain a technical education so that we might be of practical service." But young Wing, going against that narrow path, Li says, desired us to obtain a thorough education so that we might act in diplomatic positions. Young himself seemed skeptical from the beginning about the possibility and desirability of avoiding Western cultural influence. Young says from the outset that, quote, "the scheme was against the Chinese theory of national education." In the end, according to Young, in New England, the heavy weight of repression and suppression was lifted from the minds of these young students. They exulted in their freedom and leaped for joy. As to religion in particular, Yanfu Li comically illustrates just how much of a taboo Christianity was for the boys and the mission in the final chapter of his book. So just to set this up, on their first Sunday after arriving in Springfield, Li and his fellow Chinese boarder at the Vales are told to get ready for Sunday school. And they freely oblige, not having understood precisely where they were headed. They only understood the word school, and they were up for school. So they went. Soon, however, it dawns on them that they are headed into a Christian church. And let me read this off the screen. Okay. "It's a church," my companion said my companion in Chinese. "We were confirmed in our suspicions on peeping in and seeing the people rise to saying, 'Church, church,' we muttered, and rushed from the edifice with all the speed we could command. We did not stop till we got into our room, while our American friends, surprised at this move on our part and failing to overtake us, went back to the church." So these kids just bolted when they discovered they were about to enter a Christian church. And yet, in a few short years, Li himself had quietly converted to Christianity and presumably kept it a closely guarded secret throughout his time in the mission. And I think several boys did. So in the spring of 1881, just as Li was wrapping up his first year at Yale, the Qing court ordered that the CEM be closed and the boys were forced to return to China. A couple stayed behind, but not because the court let them. Despite the efforts of young Wing to get the court to keep the mission open and the efforts of U.S. supporters like former President Ulysses S. Grant and Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, the mission did, in fact, come to an end. And on to the third section. Li returns to the U.S. in February of 1884, and he does so on a mission. His express goal was to become a writer in service of the Chinese people. In the fashion of Frederick Douglass, he says, "It is my ambition to do all I can for China." When asked about his plans, Li elsewhere says, "I desire to follow up a literary career, and I think I can do a great deal of good in this country by simply correcting erroneous American ideas concerning Chinese affairs." And there's evidence, too, that this mission that Li felt so important and so personal to him as well stuck with him throughout his time in Yale. And so when he was interviewed upon completing his degree, he stuck with this idea of the importance of serving the Chinese people. So this raises a question. Having laid out this marker of an important mission, how does one prepare for such a mission? And, by my estimation, for Yanfu Li, the answer to that question seems to have been right. and then write some more. But obviously there's more to it than that, although he wrote all the time. From what I've seen in the record of Yan-Fu Li's life, that preparation for that mission also included seeking out every opportunity to learn about writing, to practice it, to write for as many occasions and purposes and for as many audiences as needed to hone his craft and to prepare himself to be the writer he wanted to be. We who teach writing know that composing for different audiences and purposes and in different genres is a powerful way to develop yourself as a writer. To my mind, this is precisely what Li is doing in the 3 years or so after his return from China and when he was a student at Yale. He's actively developing himself as a writer, feeling out the possibilities in various rhetorical situations in order to step into arenas where sinophobia, either subtle or obvious, influences readers' understandings of China and the Chinese. As I pointed out, Li wrote for a children's magazine, Wide Awake. He also served as a columnist and editor for another youth-oriented magazine, the Chautauqua Young Folks Journal, which was associated with Wide Awake. And as a student, he contributed to the competitive Yale Literary Magazine, in which he published a total of 5 pieces, 3 of which were centered on Asian and Chinese themes. Okay, yeah. Among the work Li did as a writer while working for the Lothrop Company, which published Wide Awake, was also reviewing writing footnotes for Lothrop's edition of British writer Robert Kennaway Douglas's popular book on the history and culture of China. Li is not credited by name in this book. It's in the book itself, interestingly. But advertisements such as this one did mention Li by name. Also, it seems patently obvious from the details that it had to have been Li who contributed. And so the perspective, and this is from the preface of the book, the perspective that Li could bring to this established British scholar's work was clearly valued by the Lothrop Press, as indicated in the final paragraph of the book's preface, in which says, a Chinese scholar who combines familiarity with the wisdom of his native land and acquaintance with the civilization and intelligence of America has read the text and has suggested a few remarks which have taken the form of footnotes. Probably the present book is the first work on China that has thus had the advantage of careful revision by a native of the flowery land, educated in the civilization of both the Eastern and Western hemispheres. So here we see that idea of Li as kind of a cross-cultural figure. But Li did something really extraordinary in this role of a reviewer and the writer of footnotes. Most of his footnotes are of the usual variety. You know, they provide helpful information, they clarify, maybe they offer a translation, a further explanation, or a citation for a source. Yet quite a few of Li's footnotes, in quite a few of his footnotes, he audaciously takes direct issue with Professor Douglas, which is something one doesn't do in footnotes usually. In this example, which is maybe hard for you guys to read, but I'll sort of run through it. In this example, he questions Douglas's interpretation of Confucius and casts doubt on Douglas's authority. Li points out, even indicts the author for a European cultural myopathy that prevents him from seeking out and understanding the actual practice of Chinese readers of Confucius. Where Douglas finds apparent inaccuracies or willful perversions of the truth, Li points out that, to the contrary, these are consistent with Confucianism's respect for sovereign authorities. Let me say that again, because I think I botched it. They're consistent with Confucianism's respect for sovereign authorities. Furthermore, the particular translation that Douglas uses, Lee adds, is rather a travesty than a translation, for the delicate shades of meaning and the position of words in the original, which give a clue to the moral nature of the act, are lost in the English rendering. Lee goes on to fault Douglas for merely replicating the work of a prior scholar and translator, and for his failure to consult indigenous Chinese commentaries on the text, which Lee says explain and unfold the principles by which Confucius was guided, and about which no Chinese readers are confused. To me, this is really stunning. Lee is, in a sense, going toe-to-toe with Douglas, a venerated Western expert in China and Chinese culture, art, and history, implying strongly that Western Orientalist scholars may be offering incomplete and flawed accounts of Chinese religion, culture, history, and art. In this instance, it is crystal clear that Lee is following through on that mission of correcting erroneous ideas about China and the Chinese. Another form of writing and publication that Lee engaged in is public lecturing. Very soon after he returned to the US in 1884, Lee begins giving public lectures on matters related to China and the Chinese. And actually, he gave lectures even before, as a freshman at Yale, he was giving lectures too. Not quite as many. In the 19th century, public lecturing was a vital form of publication and the dissemination of ideas. And it was a tradition that went back to before the Civil War, and which was known as the Lyceum tradition. And such public speaking gained further traction in the period in which we're talking about by the very successful Chautauqua model of self-education and camp-style assemblies. And so to go to these lectures was to educate yourself to become, a broader, a person who understands things more broadly, to be literate in knowledges and morals of different cultures. Lectures were often extracted and reported in local newspapers, which then spread nationwide through newspaper exchange networks. So, for instance, a detailed summary of a lecture that Lee gave in the John Street Congregational Church in Lowell, Massachusetts in April of 1885 was printed the following day, 1,000 miles away in Baldwin, Kansas. Here are a couple newspaper notices for lectures that Lee gave while a student at Yale. Lee could also earn some money doing these lectures, probably not much, but he could earn some, which helped him offset the cost of his education. In an interview in 1902, Lee said that he paid for his school mostly by the exercise of my jaws, another instance of Lee's humor. Lee reportedly put on quite a show in these lectures. In addition to his English fluency and erudition, newspapers avidly remarked on his humor. He was, and this is a quote, he had a very dry way of saying very funny things. Even at his Yale commencement oration on the heavy matter of Chinese exclusion, reports said that he provoked general laughter. So he had a great sense of humor. What's more, he often took the stage in traditional Chinese garb, traditional Chinese dress. According to one report, his costume included a skull cap with a false queue attached that he dramatically removed as he explained the Manchu custom of the queue and its significance. So he pulls it off, in this dramatic way. Lee's removal of his own real queue, but only a few years earlier, had signified his Westernization. This theatrical false queue removal surely was meant not only to delight, but also to signify for the public Lee's shedding of Manchu fealty and his assimilation to Western self-presentation. This before and after representation is kind of played up in the hand-drawn illustrations of Lee that accompany the 1894 newspaper interview or profile that I mentioned earlier, published in St. Louis. And that's a newspaper that Lee was working for at that time as well. His lectures, whether they were in costume or not, also frequently made use of Chinese scenes, photographs or the equivalent thereof, projected behind him with what was called a stereopticon, which is a projection device that allowed seamless dissolves from one slide to the next and could be behind a speaker. It was the latest technology of the day. I like to think of this as a good example of kind of like TED Talk of the 19th century. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. So these are some of the ways that Lee was cultivating himself as a writer capable of serving his mission to correct misunderstandings and to counteract deeply ingrained prejudice. He made his mission manifest both obviously and subtly in his lectures and his writing. I'll close out this section of the lecture with a couple examples of that. Okay, so this is from a lecture in Brooklyn, reported in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, February 26, 1886. So Lee would have been a junior at Yale. And for the sake of readability, I've provided a text, the text that concerns us here, because it's hard to read the image I have. And this is the part I wanted to focus on. He notes that the first thing which strikes even the casual observer in China is what to a foreigner seems to be oddity in the people and their customs. The contrast between those and those customs, that is, and those prevailing in the Western Hemisphere has afforded an endless topic for newspaper wit and satire. This would not be the case if the origin and meaning of Chinese customs were understood by the gentlemen who make merry over them, for their laughter arises from wonder. And wonder, as a great writer says, is the result of ignorance. I will attempt tonight not so much to trace these customs to their sources as to show their right to exist, to show that their charter of liberty is still valid. That great writer was probably Samuel Johnson. This is something I read about in my article, and Lee would have known Samuel Johnson's work very well. Okay, so here's a passage just as a comparison from Lee's book. And this passage does not actually appear. It's one of two passages that don't appear in the periodical version of the book. But it was important for Lee to add this statement, it seems. So it reads, I still continually find false ideas in America concerning the Chinese customs and manners and institutions. Small blame to the people at large who have no means of learning the truth except through newspapers or accounts of travelers who do not understand what they see in passing through our country, which is what he just talked about in the other lecture. From the time of Sir John Mandeville, travelers, with few noble exceptions, have vied with each other in relating the most wonderful stories about our ancient empire. Accordingly, what I tell in this series of articles about Chinese customs, manners, and institutions may often contradict general belief. So there's that mission again. I think it's important to focus on that idea of wonder, wonderful, when there's a sense of awe that for Lee comes from ignorance. Things are less, amazing when you are not ignorant, or you're less you're less tied up in the idea of the strangeness of something when you understand it. So it's important to keep in mind that Lee's book, his articles for children and his lectures are swimming in a sea of other representations of China and Chinese people. And as far as children's representations go, here are just a few. This is a book that came out, I think in 1885, so before Lee's book, but the same time he's writing his articles, with these just, ridiculous caricatures of Chinese people. This one is even from an illustration from a book by Louisa May Alcott, of Little Women fame. Okay, so I see that I've hit an hour in my talk. I'm going to just try to wrap up quickly, and because I'd love to have discussion or answer questions if I can. So in lieu of section 4, a brief discussion of a couple other important pieces by Lee and a kind of hasty coda. And the pieces I'm interested in looking at are The Other Side of the Chinese Question, which was his commencement oration, and The Chinese Must Stay, which I won't look at in great detail, but is based on that oration and published in a widely distributed journal. So just to set up the commencement day lecture that Lee gives, let me open all of these slides. You can see the order. He was like number 15 of 19 orations, right? He didn't have the top billing, so he's pretty much in the pack there. And yet, as you can read there, the orations were good, but that of Mr. Yanfu Li was probably the most popular. He was applauded throughout, and his witty remarks were frequently the cause of much laughter among the audience. Imagine being the valedictory speaker and your speech being, kind of trumped, so to speak, by Lee's speech. And here's another example of laudatory comments about that oration. Sorry, looking at it here myself, this is a lot of text. The program as a whole was highly credible throughout. Yanfu Li, who spoke of the other side of the Chinese question, carried off the highest honors of the occasion. He showed marked ability, and his oration was everywhere the subject of special commendation among the Yale men who heard it. So these are not just students, but they're alumni as well. As one person, well, I won't read that. Anyway, that you can see this is having quite an impact. The Other Side of the Chinese Question was then published, and I think we provided a link to it, so you can read it on your own. But just to kind of sum it up, Lee offers 3 refutations for exclusion-based or exclusion, Chinese exclusion. And he goes through and refutes these arguments. The one that labor needed in the US, and he says, labor needed in the US and funds to pay for it are not necessarily fixed sums. So this imagination that there's one pie, and if one group gets the majority of it, it shuts out the other group is just nonsensical to Lee. He also notes that the Chinese government, he's responding to this, the Chinese government is not trying to dump its redundant population on the US. We've heard rhetoric like this, in the recent past, and you can probably still hear rhetoric like this idea of dumping people from one country to another, and that fears of Mongolization of America are patently absurd and not reality-based. All right, so I won't talk much about The Chinese Must Stay, but I do recommend you taking a look at it and reading the soaring rhetoric of that first paragraph. I see there's a message in chat. Okay, all right, I'll look at that later. Okay. All right, so let me just see if I can wrap up. This is going to be hard to read too. This is just a selected list of the various things Lee did, and after he got out of Yale. He was twice married, both times to white women. That first marriage was a bit of a scandal, and it affected him deeply. Probably he was married a second time in 1897. He was connected with missionary organizations. He did some graduate work at Yale. He might have done some medical school education at Vanderbilt. It's hard to know that. He published in newspapers across the country, served as a legal interpreter, lectured throughout his life. You can find, it's interesting, you can find in the historical record, notices of him lecturing in South Carolina, just all over the place. He was involved in an attempt to open a boarding school for Chinese youth in America, kind of on the pattern of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. It didn't last long. I think it lasted a semester, and then there were some investment problems that did it in. He developed international exposition exhibits on China and Chinese life in all kinds of fairs, world fairs, and that sort of thing in the US. He was a farmer in Delaware and a member of the Delaware Grange. He ran a poultry business in Manhattan, if you can believe that, and did editorial work throughout his life in various publications. So just a quick postscript then, and then I'd like to get any questions you have. So Richard Vale Lee, in his edition of Lee's book, reprints this exchange of an interview with a customs inspector as Lee is leaving the country for the last time, and he asks, "Of what country are you now a citizen or a subject?" Lee's reply is, "It's hard to say. In 1887 or 1888, I took out my first papers to become a citizen of this country, but I never got my last papers on account of the amendment to the exclusion law preventing me." It is true, he tried to get citizenship, but there was no way to do it with the exclusion law. "Then you must be a citizen of China, is that right?" Lee's reply, "I presume so, or a citizen of no country at all." So just to close up, I have two quotes. Richard Lee says, Yanfu Lee's observation that he might be a citizen of no country at all made him a citizen of the world. And Amy Ling, the other person to whom I owe a great debt, Lee explored and lived on a cross-cultural frontier, which he called a psychological and emotional state that found external expression in his life choices and in his writings, which manifested the fluctuating double consciousness of all racial minorities. And with that, I close the presentation. Thank you very much for listening. That was a lot.
Thank you so much, Professor
You're
Duvall.
welcome.
So I would love to leave the rest of the time to our audience. So if any of you has questions or comments, that you're welcome to leave them in our like the chatting box. So Professor Duvall will just answer the questions and communicate with you. So anyone?
Yeah, I do see one.
Okay.
Sun Yat-sen was also born in Zhongshan. I'm going to mess up the names, I'm sorry. Many immigrants came to the US from Quihang village. Did Lee write about Sun Yat-sen? And thank you for your comment. Thank you for your thanks. I don't know of any writing on that. That doesn't mean he didn't. There's so much that he probably wrote that we'll never see. So I have not run across that, but that does not at all mean he never did. There's another one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question from Jiha Lee.
I see the one from Quinn Shu, sorry. Irreconcilable conflicts.
Scroll a little bit fast. Okay. Yeah. So
I'm sorry. Yeah. Are there any irreconcilable conflicts between Yan Fu Li's dual identities as an American and as a Chinese? He didn't think so. The culture certainly thought so. The sort of legal and cultural regime of the United States was against that. It's against, to some extent, even today, it's against dual identities. So I don't think he felt any conflicts. He felt like he could be a citizen of both, that he could be in both worlds. So that's an opinion. I would have to think about it a little bit more, but on the whole, I think he did not see a conflict. So there was a question about why I use the somewhat romantic life of Li. Okay, I think Li means, by romance, Li means adventure. There's the romance that has to do with, amorous relationships between people, but then there's also the idea of romance in the culture, especially in Western culture too. It goes back to King Arthur, and there's all of this kind of like daring deeds and everything else. And I think he used it really ironically. It is a kind of romantic ideal that he would just give up. And he's a young man, right? That he would just sort of go, I'm going to go back to the US and I'm going to do great things. And there's a kind of romantic quality to that. But the difficulty that he encounters in doing that, because it's such a hard environment for a Chinese person in the US at that time, for sure, is just overwhelming. So I think he uses it ironically, and he's being very understated and kind of darkly humorous too. I see a question about elaborating on his time in NYC. He lived in, I would have to look at all of my, I have like just copious, I've got a database full of hundreds of newspaper articles. He was splitting time between New York and New Jersey, actually. He was serving as an editor for a newspaper in New Jersey. He was then also running a poultry business in Manhattan at the same time. I'm not sure what else, off the top of my head, I can't say what else he was doing in New York at that time. Yeah, so I wish I could answer with more detail. I see a number of other questions that I can't read.
I'm not pretty sure. It's not a question. Seems like it's like the family tree or whatever. So yeah, I can't see very clearly. Oh no, it's the name list of the first group of the kids sent to the US to study, I guess.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, well, I don't know how this our audience find this picture, but it's pretty, I guess, precious.
Okay.
And so it's pretty interesting. Okay, so here is another question from Xin Xue.
Okay. Do you view a person with no country as a kind of transcendence of any limits? I think that this is kind of like the somewhat romantic question in that it's not limitless, right? He would clearly like to live in both places. But there is a kind of the in-betweenness of that life is maybe a very painful life, but it's also a very valuable life in that it can represent to the rest of us what that painful in-between experience is. I think Richard Lee, his grandson, who wrote that, the idea that he's a citizen of the world really does see that as an ultimate triumph of Yan Fu Li after, long after he has passed. But I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer or not. Yep. Okay. So it's a list of the second detachment from that CEM, handwritten, 1905 in China. Yeah. So Yanfu Li is among that group, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so next question
Oh,
from Zheha Li, and also,
uh-huh. In the time of Chinese Exclusion Act, could Chinese be selected to be a Valendi? I'm not sure what Valendi is, what that means.
um,
Oh, valedictorian.
mhm,
Yes. Oh, so here's the interesting thing. So, okay, I guess, yeah, all right, I see. That's a good question. So, before the Chinese Exclusion Act, when he was at Hopkins Grammar School, which is kind of like a advanced high school, he was valedictorian, but that's like 18, that's before the Chinese Exclusion Act. I don't think any laws prevent any university or any school from giving a valedictorian distinction to anyone. However, culturally, it might have been very difficult. And there's an interesting, like, yeah. So I don't think that a law applies because these are private institutions. Maybe unless they're public institutions governed by state governments, it's kind of a complicated question. I don't think, Lee probably could have been valedictorian. I don't know. But who knows what kind of prejudice was operative? That's a very good question, though. Thank you, Roy
yes,
Dang,
this
for
is
that comment.
this is a comment, and
Thank you so
yeah,
much.
thank you for remembering their life, their
Uh,
journey. Mm-hmm.
One of the links I provided in that document that I posted is to an exhibit at the Connecticut Historical Society, and there's an exhibit right now on the Chinese Educational Mission because they were housed in Hartford, and there is a virtual tour, and I looked at it and it was amazing, and that they're doing a great job of that kind of remembrance.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. So actually, I have a question. So before our lecture, so I did some research
Oh,
about
okay.
like the Yanfu Li.
Uh-huh.
So actually, I found the original edition of the first book.
Yes.
So I'm wondering
Yeah.
how many books so they
Oh,
published at the time.
I do know that it went into a second printing in
Mhm,
1887. There's a 1903 edition. There are several editions that come up over time.
mhm,
It appeared on a lot of library lists. Like, I could find these lists from, like, say, 1895, books that should be in your library.
mhm,
So it was a very popular book. And it would change over time too. There's a 1903, the 1903 edition has these photos in it. And I remember reading an article by a scholar who was like complaining about the photos, but those weren't original. They were added in later, and they're just sort of window dressing, like
mhm.
they don't have to do with the text. Lee didn't have them. He has a couple illustrations, but they're hand drawn. I don't have an exact answer for you, but it was so popular, it sold out its original run. It had to be printed a second time.
Mhm.
He sold his copyright to it to the Lothrop Company, so he
Mhm.
didn't see any benefits financially other than whatever he got paid for his copyright.
Mhm.
It also got repackaged in a series called Children of Other Lands, which is one of the things I talk about in my article, because people think that was the origin of it. And it wasn't. It was in this children's magazine.
Okay, thank you. Thank you
Mhm.
so much. Okay, so
Uh-huh.
here come up more questions.
Yeah, I see that. I've got a question about using Yanfu Li instead of on Li Yanfu, I guess, in the US. Oh, I don't know about the pronunciation. I can't speak
Oh,
to that.
okay. Probably I can answer this question
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
obviously, so like
Mhm.
in China, Enfuli, and I guess it's a kind of Enful. It's in the like the pinyin way, and to pronounce that. But back
Right.
to then, and
Mhm.
pinyin was not existed yet.
Okay.
So, and I
Yeah.
guess like Americans just use the
Mhm.
alphabet based on the English way to
Right.
pronounce that. That's why
Right.
now, and we
Mhm.
can say it's a Yang Fu Li. But after that, when pinyin, come out, and so
Mhm.
based on the Chinese character, the correct way and to
Mhm.
or the pinyin way to spell that, which is ENFU and Enfu Li. And
Right.
the Li actually now in pinyin is Li instead of
Li.
Le.
Yes.
Yes.
Mhm.
But I guess this is the change
Yeah.
of the
Mhm.
spelling.
Yeah, I think that these decisions for how to render non-English names from whatever language into English are made locally. They're made based on sounds. Like people here in Ellis Island, they're getting the names of
Mm-hmm.
immigrants and they're writing them down like, oh, that sounds like this. So, and when you do research on Yanfu Li in
Mm-hmm.
newspapers, you have to look up not just PHOU, but
Mm-hmm.
FOO,
Yeah.
FOU.
Yeah.
um,
Exactly.
it comes out in a number of ways, and sometimes
Yeah.
the letters are flipped, so it's
Yeah.
Yanfu, Yanfu. It's
Yes. Yeah. And also basic on Ling's guess. So
uh-huh.
maybe Yanfu Li is from the pronunciation of his mom, which is Cantonese. I'm not sure about that.
Oh,
I don't know if anyone of our audience today
mhm.
can speak
Yeah.
Cantonese. I doubt if Cantonese pronunciation is
Mm,
Yanfu Li, but could be a little bit
mm,
dialect
yeah.
accent. Mhm.
That's yeah, those are things I don't know much about.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay.
I see another
So.
question.
Mhm.
What do you think I want to make sure I don't miss any. Right, okay. What do you think the differences about personal attitudes to China and Chinese between Yanfu Li and other Chinese American writers? I mean, because Yanfu Li has spent most of his time devoting his career to transform other people's view of China. So comparatively, um, I don't know if I have an answer right now. It's a good question. There weren't at his well-known writers that were Chinese in his day were very few. There's Wang Chenfu, who is a really important figure. He precedes Yanfu Li in the country by 10 or 20 years. And he actually became a citizen of the United States. This was well before the exclusion regime. Has a different kind of attitude. I think, okay, so here's a good example. Wang Chenfu wrote an essay for the North Atlantic Review called Why I Am a Heathen, in which he talked about all the reasons why he just couldn't hang with Christianity. He couldn't handle, he just didn't like Christianity, but he liked Confucianism. Um, and then Yanfu Li wrote a reply to Wang Chenfu, which was Why I Am Not a Heathen, in which he explained all the reasons why he had converted to Christianity. So I think that's a case of two Chinese American writers with very different ideas about how to present themselves in an American culture with respect to religion. Also, I believe Wang Chenfu wore traditional Chinese clothing most of the time and only periodically would wear Western attire. And I believe Yanfu Li had just sort of completely assimilated to Western. Yeah. So I don't know if that is much of an answer, but that's at least a case of two writers disagreeing.
Okay, thank you. And
Yeah.
any more questions? Okay.
There's something.
Americano.
Okay, that we're still in Cantonese.
张开设 and Dr.
Okay.
Sun Yat-sen both are Cantonese. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Sun Yat-sen in Mandarin it's Sun Yat-sen, so it's a bit different. American mostly think Cantonese is Chinese, but actually Cantonese is just one of dialects of yes, Cantonese was taken as a dialect in China. So
Okay.
and Kathy Huang say, yeah, fantastic
Thank
talk.
you, Kathy.
Thank you, Professor
You've
Duvall.
seen this more than once, Kathy. Thank you for coming this time too. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Duvall, and thank you for our audience today. Thank you for your questions and your comments. So definitely today we learned a lot about this first writer who wrote, China's story in English in America, and also like we know a little bit about Charleston, right?
Oh, yes.
So yeah, I've been Charleston before. So Charleston is such a beautiful places. So
it's a nice place. I got lucky to get the job here.
Exactly. So like we're so happy that we can have Mr. Duvall today and to tell us about this story from Charleston. And thank you for all of you tonight and to join us.
Yes.
Thank you. So before like we end this lecture today, so we'd love to introduce a little bit about our lecture next week. So our lecture next week, I'm sorry, next time. So it's going to be in 2 weeks. So can you say that now? No?
Yeah, fine with me.
Okay, let me try again. Okay. Okay, can everybody see? So our next lecture will be something about the Chinese lifestyle. So this is the elegant Chinese lifestyle, the art of living in a fulfilling life. So which is a little bit about Zen style. So if anyone want to know about this, like Chinese traditional lifestyle, so you're welcome to join us next time. So it will be on June 24th, which is a Saturday. Same time from 8 to 9:30 p.m. So if you're in mainland China in Beijing, so it's going to be in Beijing time, June 25th, 8 to 9:30 a.m. So and in case any of you today, so you don't speak English very well, and 我们下一次的讲座呢将会是在6月24日。也就是星期六的早8点到9点半，那北京时间的6月25日早8点到9点半。所以如果您对我们下一次讲座感兴趣的话，欢迎您届时参加。感谢。Okay, thank you today. Thank you everybody again today for joining us, and thank you Professor Duvall again, and for sharing this beautiful story. And it's gonna be our honor if we can just invite you again, to share more about the stories about Chinese writers, about Asian or American Chinese literature in America. It's gonna be our honor, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so 那我们今天的讲座呢到这里就结束了。再一次感谢这个杜威尔教授以及我们今天的嘉宾们，非常感谢大家。那我们下一次再见。So see you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks again. I appreciate it.
Thank you.